For early access plus exclusive content, facilitated discussions, live one-on-one Q&As, and more, become a patron at patreon.com/BrucePointset. Welcome back to the Church of Can't Stop, Won't Stop. I'm your host, Bruce Pointset, and this is the show where we use Can't Stop, Won't Stop, History of the Hip Hop Generation by Jeff Chang as a jump off to talk about the history of Portland hip hop and the Oregon hip hop story with a special guest. And I'm blessed to have another legend with me today, Mr. Mike Crenshaw, MC, poet, educator, activist, nonprofit president now. How are you doing, Mike?
I'm good, Bruce. I'm blessed to be doing what I love and loving what I do and able to just continue to pursue the things that I've been passionate about for most of my life and have an impact in my community,
Yeah. And like I said, you're a very busy man. So I appreciate you taking the time to, chat with me today. And, speaking of projects, you're actually going to be featured in a documentary coming up on PBS about Minneapolis anti-racist skinhead movement.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, before we talk about Can't Stop, Won't Stop, I think a lot of people, obviously, like when they hear skinhead, they think Nazis, they think that. So, this is going to be, I think, pretty enlightening for a lot of people. But could you just talk about that for a minute?
Sure. The skinhead subculture started in the late 60s. The post-World War II era caused a lot of migration to happen from different colonial areas to their, I guess, the mother country, right? And I always feel weird referencing Britain as the mother country in terms of Black people. But Jamaica was a British colony, and everybody in the colonies was basically a citizen of Britain. And so there was this migration of Black folks from Jamaica to England post-World War II, and some of the cultural elements that the Black folks from Jamaica brought with them started to kind of morph in the environment of the British communities that they lived in. And from that, different kinds of musical genres were born. A British form of ska, which was one of the primary forms of reggae music, was born, heavily influenced by R&B in the US. People's dress styles were indicative of going out and dancing on the weekends and looking sharp. And that was the rude boy. And so the rude boy was the stylistic cat that was representing Jamaican culture that started mixing with the white kids in England. And that's when the skinhead movement was born, really. And it was about these white kids and these Black kids coming together and listening to the same music and dressing in the same styles. Later, in the 60s, going into the 70s, there was a period of economic woes that England was going through. And similar to the United States, this happens time and time again here, right-wing politicians and people who were oriented to a right-wing nationalist ideology in England started scapegoating immigrants and people of color for the economic problems that England was facing. And it was at that point in which there was a split in the movement in the skinhead subculture, and some white skinheads became right-wing, became racist. And unfortunately, the legacy of the right-wing white neo-Nazi skinhead became what the media focused on. So by the time the public that wasn't involved with the subculture got wind of what a skinhead was, it was in this very narrow narrative that said that all skinheads were Nazis. But those of us who study the culture and who were participating in the culture who weren't Nazis, we know that that's not the truth. So that's the historical context. And when I was a teenager in Minneapolis in the 80s, a group of friends and I started toying with the the idea of becoming skinheads, and we committed. We leaned in, we learned about the culture, we bought the clothes, we listened to the music, and we had the camaraderie and brotherhood amongst us and sisterhood amongst us. And not too long after we started hanging out together and figuring out how we wanted to act and look and everything, the media started influencing locals in Minneapolis to try to be neo-Nazi skinheads. Some of these white kids in the suburbs thought it was cool. Maybe they were disenfranchised, maybe they felt angry. I don't know what their reasons were, but there was a local guy who was a member of the Ku Klux Klan. He organized some of them into a white gang called the White Knights. And once we found out that they were a presence in our city, we went to where they were and we confronted them and we said, hey, you guys can't operate, basically. You know, we gave them a chance to denounce their white power shit. And we told them that if they didn't, the next time we saw them, you know, we were going to check in with them. And if they still were claiming white power, that there was going to be violence. And so that was the beginning of the story of the Baldies, how we established ourselves as a fighting force against these neo-Nazis who have been organized by this Klansmen. And in order, over a period of years, our crew, the Minneapolis Baldies, gave birth to a broader organization and network called Anti-Racist Action, in which we reached out to other anti-racist and anti-fascist youth groups and crews and so forth all over the Midwest and ultimately all over the United States. And there even was an ARA chapter in Canada. And I'm not sure if there were any in Europe, but it became a significant movement. And we fought Nazis and had a subculture, and there was a lot of camaraderie there, you know, but also a lot of violence and trauma, and definitely the politicization of a significant number of young people. You know, we were teenagers.
Right. Yeah. And that, I mean, that really kind of, you know, one of the things I love about this book is just as far as like entry points and connections, like, I mean, that's really like a perfect entry point to the chapter we're talking about today, which is Things Fall Apart, the rise of the post-civil rights era. Because, you know, you cover a lot of subjects there about both like the diaspora, kind of like African diaspora, just kind of diasporic approach, I should say. And then also just like this, again, post-civil rights era, there's these moments of unity and then these moments of splintering. So, you know, the first part I want to talk about those, because this chapter starts with kind of more in the unity phase of like the height of the anti-apartheid movement in the 80s. And I was curious because, like you said, you talked about joining the Minneapolis Baldies, or well, creating the Minneapolis Baldies back in like the 80s. Do you have memories of the anti-apartheid movement from that time?
Yes, I do. You know, which is really impactful. Hindsight's 2020. You know, I remember people talking about boycott Coke because Coke supports apartheid. You know, and I remember seeing the news reports of the resistance and the uprisings, and you know, millions of people in the streets in South Africa doing the toy, you know, and I didn't know what the toy was at the time. I would later come to discover the definition of toy and meet people who taught me how to do the toy and meet the children of the apartheid generation, the sons and daughters literally of these freedom fighters, okay, in South Africa, in Johannesburg, in Cape Town. But when I was a kid in the 80s and 90s, looking at it, it was all news on TV. It was a cause that I was sympathetic and supportive of ideologically, but I didn't really know what I could do. I remember the pop culture, entertainment industry responses, you know, big artists coming out and talking about, you know, actors and I think there were a couple songs that were like "We Are the World" type songs, you know, to bring attention to the issue. So 1994, apartheid ends, and South Africa is now under Black government, majority Black government instead of the minority white. And for our listeners that might not understand, You know, apartheid is a system in which the white settler colonialists in South Africa created a system of political and economic power and domination, and basically disenfranchised the non-white natives of South Africa. And it was a very violent and repressive regime. A lot of police terror, a lot of racial terror. Thousands of people disappeared, died, incarcerated, and kept in, you know, subhuman living conditions, displaced to communities where people would have to basically make shanty towns out of whatever materials they could gather, shacks out of tires and corrugated, steel, and people would have to put in these communities that would expand outside of the major cities. These poor Black folks would basically have to put in their own infrastructure for electricity, for plumbing and so forth. But because these cities weren't officially sanctioned by the local government and the apartheid government, they were subject to being attacked and destroyed. So you would have whole communities bulldozed to the ground. You know, thousands of people displaced just when the government and the police wanted to come in and clear somewhere out. And of course, they used the resistance and the freedom fighters as an excuse to target people. So that said, that's what was going on while I was over here, you know, being an anti-racist skinhead, getting politicized, learning about the history of people's movements and struggles for social justice in the United States, but then slowly listening to the message and the reggae music, you know, that was part of my, you know, the demographic of music that I enjoyed, and starting to understand my role as a Black person in the diaspora, being connected to this global identity of being an African and a person of African descent. And not just because my skin is brown and I could trace a lot of my genetic roots to the continent of Africa, but because Black people have been forced through these processes of colonialism and imperialism and the development of capitalism and exploitation, we've been forced into a position where our very identity is something of a political reality, where the places that we live and our bodies and our lives and our energy and our time as a human resource is something that's always exploited by the most powerful, and something that is often expendable when it comes to the state exercising. Our lives are expendable when it comes to the state exercising its dominance. And seeing that this wasn't just something that we face in our communities in the US, but something that Africans face on the continent of Africa as well, has been that understanding has been a large part of my development and my consciousness.
Mm-hmm. And, you know, it's, again, not just in like the consciousness, but like in the work. One of the things I said, you know, since I've known you, you know, really been big on just like pushing this idea of like a Pan-African approach, like a Pan-African like consciousness. Then, you know, you participated, you know, in projects like the African Hip Hop Caravan, right, where, you know, beyond just the approach, beyond the, you know, beyond just like intellectualizing it, beyond, you know, keeping awareness, it's actually like building those bridges, building those relationships, building those communities. So can you talk about what the African Hip Hop Caravan is and kind of like what started it?
Yeah, the African Hip Hop Caravan is a project started by indigenous African hip hop collectives. So I want people to understand, you know, in the United States, when we hear the term indigenous, we think about First Nations, Native American people, some people would call American Indians. So there are all these different ethnic groups that lived here before the Europeans came here, right? And those are the indigenous people. You know, they can trace their roots back to the beginning of their human existence, and it's often tied to the land and geography where they come from. And Africa has the same thing. People in Africa often identify with whatever their ethnic group is before they would call themselves Black. So it would be their ethnic group, maybe their tribal affiliation, then it would be their nationality, you know, what country they live in, and then ultimately African as the people of the continent of Africa. You know, but a lot of times some of these terms and definitions that we associate with people's identity were things that were created as a product of colonialism, right? And so it's important for Indigenous African people to orient to who they are, separate from the colonial imposition that says you are Black or you are Rhodesian, you know, which was the name of Zimbabwe before it was, because it was named after Cecil Rhodes, who was a colonist, right? But after the anti-colonial struggles of the 60s and into the 70s, Zimbabwe got its independence, okay, and it's had a Black government ever since. So the African Hip Hop Caravan is made up of these hip hop collectives that I encountered. I met two of the representatives in Zimbabwe in 2012. And the reason I was in Zimbabwe in 2012 was to play a music festival called the Shoko Music Fest. The reason I got invited to play the Shoko Music Fest was because I went to Rwanda in 2004 on the 10-year anniversary of the Rwandese genocide. And the reason I was in Rwanda in 2004 was, as an activist, I was invited to participate in a conference with up to 60 African organizers, activists, and youth workers. And that conference was organized by a group called African Youth Initiative Network and the American Friends Service Committee, which was a Quaker organization out of Philly. That's where they're headquartered at, but they were doing a lot of peace work on the continent of Africa, meaning places that had been ravaged by poverty, civil war, and so forth. So they invited me to this conference on economic justice, youth empowerment, genocide reconciliation, and HIV/AIDS. And it was there that I met organizers from all over Africa. And I helped launch, as an outcome of that conference, I helped launch, along with Global Fam and my business partner, Morgan DeLady, and Education Without Borders, my nonprofit that I'm the president of, we helped launch 2 computer centers in Burundi, Central Africa, which is a neighboring country, Rwanda. And so that work impacted the network that I was part of when I was in Rwanda. And that's how I got invited to Zimbabwe as an artist. And when I played the festival in Zimbabwe 8 years later in 2012, I met some Africans that were organizing the African Hip Hop Caravan. And I overheard them talking, and I got curious. I started asking questions about it. Well, it turns out these Africans actually knew about the work I did to help the computer center. And so they invited me to participate in the African Hip Hop Caravan project as an organizer and an artist. And so my job was then to go back to the United States and build support, material support for the project, help raise funds, and do a lot of administrative work to help launch the project. And in 2013, we went on the first African Hip Hop Caravan. I was the only person from the United States on the caravan. It was a German artist, but everybody else was from either Cape Town, South Africa, Harare, Zimbabwe, or Johannesburg, South Africa. Those are the 3 cities we went to. Then we spent a week in each city, do a series of events, concerts, symposiums, media appearances, and so forth. And it's a dynamite model, you know. I've utilized it in my own organizing here. And also was able to attend, you know, hip hop cultural exchange in Russia as well, using the same model. Did the same thing in Cuba. So the next year we went back 2013 and we added Kenya. And then in 2014 we added Tanzania. So now the hip hop caravan is Arusha, Tanzania, Nairobi, Kenya, Harare, Zimbabwe, Cape Town, South Africa. I think 2016 was the last kind of touring iteration of the project, because it's a grassroots project, and you know we burn the candle at both ends to put it off, and we just needed to take a step back. So this year we're talking about picking it up again, but in the virtual format due to the pandemic, and also because the virtual format alleviates barriers that would be imposed by physically trying to travel, getting on planes and going across borders and visas and shots and everything. We could actually potentially expand it to an international hip hop caravan. So all the participants from these different hip hop collectives are people who are engaged in their communities locally and globally as well. So we might be organizing. I'm gonna have to check back in with the team. But last I heard, that was the move. Like, let's do the international hip hop caravan, led by those of us who organized the African hip hop caravan. So yeah, I think that participating in the caravan, it did a lot. It was a very multi-dimensional experience. Forever grateful. One of the most important experiences I've had as a human, and definitely is guiding my destiny and my purpose on the planet in terms of these multiple opportunities I've had to connect as a person of African descent living in the diaspora, living in the United States. These opportunities I've had to connect culturally with people back home on the continent through hip hop. It's hip hop and social justice activism combined that have created this lane in which I get to physically interact and go see the places and meet the people and hear the stories and see with my own eyes and feel with my own senses what it's like to be in Africa amongst Africans. We often make time to see the natural beauty when I'm there, but we're not on no tourist type of trip. It's pretty bare bones. We're eating together with our hands. Sometimes, freshly butchered meat from the market, wrapped up in newspaper in the back of a pickup truck. We're sometimes sleeping 5-6 people in the room and couch surfing. We're not staying in 5-star hotels. We're taking public transit, but it's an adventure. It's real time with real people, and you get in that kind of environment, far away from home for us that aren't from there. Relying on our local comrades to show us the ropes. We form these bonds with people that really become like extended family. And one of my goals is I've only taken a couple of youth with me on the caravan, but one of my goals is that I'm currently working on in the long term.
And when you say youth, like youth artist or?
Yeah, so I took a high school student by the name, he was a high school student, Baki Coles, back in 2015. I took a young DJ Alicia B, on that same trip, and she was from Denver. And then I've only taken 2 young folks from the United States. I've taken DJ Clavicle, shout out to DJ Clavicle from Portland. He went over there with me on the first trip. But I'm working diligently, and it takes a long time to be able to take groups of youth, high school students, to the continent and participate in the caravan. And one of the reasons, there are lots of reasons for that, but one of my main intentions of doing that is to plug young people into a network that they can use socially, professionally, and creatively, to where once I introduce you to some of these people and you become comrades, I don't even need to be around. You can contact them directly. You can set up and establish your own tours and your own trips, and y'all can work on collaborating digitally and virtually, putting out albums together or whatever, And so I think my role as an elder is to take some of these opportunities that I've been able to experience that have been transformative and make those opportunities available for people coming behind me. But I also want to remove some of the barriers so that things that took me 15, 20 years to figure out how to make happen, I want some of these young people to be able to do it early in their careers, without having to take 10, 15 years, 20 years to discover some of these ways to interact globally, as an artist, as an African in the diaspora.
Right. And, that kind of brings me to we're talking about unity and kind of like, again, building coalitions, building relationships. And a big part of this chapter is kind of the splintering of that, specifically, post civil rights, kind of like during the anti-apartheid movement. But I want to take one passage from Jeff Chang here that I think kind of speaks to some of those issues you're discussing. Is from this section, The World of Danger. Chang writes, with each going its own way, efforts turn to securing more narrow forms of power. The Northern Black civil rights leadership came together to vault a number of Blacks into elected office, but steadily lost ground with their urban youth constituencies. They abandoned popular base building and leaned increasingly on electoral politics and media advocacy. Youths of color, considered marginal to the elections process and invisible in the pop culture mainstream, were abandoned. By the mid-1980s, there was barely any continuity between youth organizers and activists who were emerging of necessity to address their own issues, and the civil rights establishment, who had long given up on developing young leaders. And so, yeah, when I read that, I just think about what you're talking about as far as, again, specifically trying to get youth plugged in, because there is, for, some, organizing missteps as well as just the structural stuff around us, it feels like there's just all these efforts and all these forces working towards, again, I don't want to, what am I looking for? Sometimes divide and conquer gets thrown around, but there's, at the same time, it is definitely like, it's very real. And some of it is very intentional. Some of it is just, playing off of our programming. So it takes that intentionality. And as you're kind of talking about now, that patience to really see it through. But, do you see, I was curious as far as, we're talking about historically, but, history repeats itself, right? So even we're looking at, right now in Portland, I guess, would you say from your experience, do you see sort of these same forces at work? Or do you see the same splintering happening?
Yeah, most definitely. Empire is relatively new in terms of human history on Earth, right? The current Western civilization dominated geopolitical, economic, militaristic structure of nation states that we live in right now came to prominence on the exploitation of Black labor, on genocidal wars and campaigns against indigenous people and First Nations people. So when what we see in society is just a current iteration of this historical process that's been playing out. Nothing we do today is anything less than inextricably linked to everything that has come before. When we get up in the morning and we go to work, when we get our check and there's money that's been taken out of our check, or if we're contractors, the money that we're responsible to pay to the IRS for taxes and what those dollars actually fund, the public servants in the form of the police, who often operate as a paramilitary occupying force in our communities and always have, the issues around police terror and racial violence, whiteness as a structure in society that is often denies its own existence and acts as if it's a victim when people in social movements attempt to hold white supremacy and whiteness accountable for the damage and the harm that exists in our society, and the trauma that has been passed down in our bodies from generation to generation. It's all part of a continuum. When I heard, back after Trayvon Martin got killed in Florida by George Zimmerman and Black Lives Matter comes out, because I have a reference point, I'm a child of the 70s, I'm seeing the continuation of the Black liberation movement in Black Lives Matter. I'm seeing what people are doing by taking to the streets and demanding change and defunding the police and abolishing the police, and establishing global support for the movement for Black lives is reminiscent of social movements of the past. And we start to understand that these social movements are part of the long continuum of Black liberation. And they're all connected. And the consciousness and awareness that young people arrive at through observing and reacting and responding to the conditions of their day-to-day lives is something that our people have been organizing to overcome since we were taken from our homelands. So I'm not under the illusion that there's something post-racial about the United States of America, or for a lot of European countries. You know, anti-Blackness is still such a major force in all the areas of societal function. You know, Francis Fresh Welsing talked about the 9 areas of human activity: economics, entertainment, education, labor law, politics, sex, religion, and war. You can't, everybody's talking about the new Chappelle. Just watch the new Chappelle, and it's forcing us, his narrative is forcing us to look at, to navigate these questions around, racial identity, sexual identity, gender. But whenever we're going to look at these things, we still have to look at it within the context of the power dynamic. And in the hierarchy of this vertical power dynamic, Black folks and Indigenous folks are always at the bottom. Non-men, however you want to identify on the spectrum, are always at the bottom. And you can participate in the structure. You can be a woman or a trans person, somebody that's not heterosexual. You can be a Black person, a person of color, an Indigenous person, and participate in the system. And you can achieve opportunity and wealth for yourself on a personal and individual level. But what you're not able to do in that system is get that system to stop being what it has always been. Right. And so what we come to understand as freedom fighters is that the only way for this system to be other than it is for us to not interact with it to the degree that that's ever even possible, which opens up the conversation about, well, how do we behave in a revolutionary manner? How do we decolonize? How do we extract ourselves from this system that exists solely in an exploitative relationship with our very lives? Like how much money and energy do I make for somebody who's exploiting my labor between the time I start working and the time I die? How much of that energy in a 40-hour, 60-hour work week actually enriches me and the lives of my family beyond sustaining us so we can continue to go to work? And what would our lives be like if we were, as working class people, even if we're middle class, even if we're upper middle class, we're still not the ruling class. We still have to earn our living by selling our labor for the duration of our lives, And if we don't get sick and die, and if we live long enough, what do we actually have to contribute to the future? And so this very system that rose up off the oppression of our people and exploitation of our people is the same system that's causing a global climate catastrophe that threatens all life on Earth. And this is happening in our lifetime, not in the distant future. So I think that there's a lot at stake and there's a lot to talk about, and it can be difficult sometimes because a lot of us as Black folks, we don't feel like we ever even fully got to come to terms with the identity politics of being Black in capitalism, being Black in America, and we're talking about divide and conquer, man. We got these ADOS folks talking about, well, I'm an African descendant of slaves, and I want the same rights that these white people have in the United States. And also, I don't feel like I'm African. I'm more connected to the United States. I've never been to Africa. I don't speak any African languages. And this is where I'm going to plant my flag and, make my mark because I'm American. And there's a lot of, in those narratives, I find a lot of ignorance and hostility towards African people, which is counterproductive to Pan-African consciousness, because the same systems that pimp and exploit and destroy life on the continent are the same ones in operation here. So when they got us looking at each other like we're each other's problem, then they're walking away with the spoils all day. And that's how it always is, you know. Haiti, you know, the billions of dollars of debt that Haiti owed to France in such a punitive way, and being the first Black republic, independent Black republic in this hemisphere, is the reason why Haiti is so economically impoverished is because of that. Because the European, the United States, these banks wanted to bring Haiti to its knees and collaborate to keep Haiti on its knees. So all these things, these global realities, the exploitation of Black people as a human resource and the exploitation of the lands we occupy as natural resources for profit are so central to history and what's going on currently that once you understand that, then we have a better, clearer perception of what white supremacy actually is and why it operates and how it operates in the way it does to maintain white dominance and control over the global economy through force and violence.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I was just gonna say that I think that's so. I mean, you touched on a lot of stuff there, and actually, I just watched that Chappelle special last night, and yeah, that's a whole other conversation. I got a lot of thoughts, but you know, what you talk about as far as contextualization of this and like how these systems, you know, even if we're at least actively trying to disinvest from these systems, how they can still, you know, shape our approaches. And, you know, Jeff Chang has this quote here on a section called Enraged and Disengaged, where he talks about during the last 2 decades of the millennium, neoconservatives with the acquiescence of quote unquote moderates in both parties turned back a half century of liberalism. Worker safety and environmental protections were undermined. The size and clout of labor unions atrophied to their weakest since the outbreak of World War II. Hundreds of billions of dollars were shifted from battling poverty into building the military. Responsibility was no longer preceded by the word social, but by the word individual.
that's right.
And that's just something I see so much, even in movements that are specifically trying to be anti-racist, anti-capitalist, you know, whether it's like the appeal of the militarized kind of, and I get it to a certain degree, but like, so that kind of like more militaristic approach, or the appeal of this idea, and whether it's, you know, fueling something like saviorism or just fueling this, again, this approach that I can be the hero or someone needs to be the hero to fix these systemic problems. And this focus, again, on individuals, this focus on, you know, and it builds, I work in the media, you know, individualism is great for narrative. I understand that, but in terms of actively, again, dismantling some of these systems, actively, you know, resisting this, it, you know, it feeds into it in another way, or it sows the division, or it leads to like something I've been really, you know, thinking about a lot lately is just like, I watched this documentary series on Netflix called How to Be a Tyrant, where, you know, they kind of just go into, you know, they frame it up as this like, so you want to take over the world or whatever. Here's the steps that, you know, these people through history took. But what really kind of like stuck with me is just, you know, how does the quote unquote strongman leader arise? Because in this, you know, in this marketplace of ideas, how many people are willing to do, you know, if someone steps out and says, I'm willing to do the things that you're not supposed to do, if I'm willing to impose the violence or use these systems to impose the violence, and who's going to stop me? That person can rise to power. That person can, you know, and it doesn't have to be, you know, I mean, we saw it in this country. We saw, you know, Donald Trump become the president. It doesn't have to be the most savvy, intelligent person in the world, but there are certain things that allow people, or, you know, again, people playing on, whether it's human nature, playing on the systems, playing on the economics, playing on, again, a culture, a world where our economy is investing more and more money into the military. We see, if we watch sports, you see, a commercial for the Navy or the Army, every break.
Yeah, when you go to the movies, instead of previews before the movie, they're showing you recruitment cards. That's crazy to me. And then the CIA coming out with this new woke branding. You seen any of those commercials?
Yeah.
Next woman and then talking about liberation and like the CIA is actually functioning to bring freedom, justice, and democracy, when that's like a terrorist organization, and yeah, like what you said about the hyper individualistic narrative where the individual wins the day and is going to save the world, and how much in alignment with white supremacist thinking that narrative is, versus the collective potential of community and decentralized leadership where it's all for one and one for all, and nothing about us without us, and each one teach one, and lift as we climb. And these things that have come out of our social movements where none of us is free if one of us is in bondage, and that people's movement is the greatest threat to the dominant system. And that's why, when leaders emerged and leaders were representative of people's movement, those leaders had to be destroyed. They had to be discredited, they had to be murdered, and they had to be incarcerated. And a lot of those folks are still in prison today. People who were active in the Black Liberation Movement, the Black Panther Party, Abu Jamal, Sudiata Akoli. There are people in exile like Assata Shakur, Pete O'Neill over in Tanzania. So we are at odds with a system that some of us don't realize we're at odds with it. We just unconsciously participate in it. But if you actively organize against the ravages of this system, you'll be targeted. And that's what lets you know, once you understand that, then you understand the nature of what you're dealing with. When we as children were actively fighting white supremacists, but when the gang task force would show up, they would target us, not them. And when the white supremacists wanted to march and intimidate people through racist rhetoric, they would have the police protect them. And we see the same things today with the Proud Boys and all these far right or outright groups, what happened in Charlottesville, what happens in the streets of Portland and Olympia and Tacoma and Vancouver and all over the country. Every now and then one of them will be arrested, but white entitlement is so threatened right now, and has been really, from my observation, the uptick in white anger and rage aimed at the fear of white folks being disenfranchised. It really kind of started to come to the surface in the lead up to the Obama election, because they were being mobilized by the fact that this Black man was gaining prominence in the political spheres of electoral politics and was possibly going to be the president. That's when a lot of that stuff started showing up again in the way where they're overt and militant and public and saying, hell no, this is white man's country. And that's what the whole slogan, Make America Great Again, it's not even, they call it a dog whistle in the media. It's not a dog whistle. It's a very blatant, racist assertion. Like, let's make sure white people stay on top. That's what that is. Mm-hmm. So, the violence that's part of that is something that we have to contend with going forward, because the economic realities of the world are not going to put working class white people in a position of privilege much longer. And they're going to be sharing some of the same social conditions as us, even though in a generational sense, they've had chronologically and proportionally more privilege than any Black person in this country or any person of color or indigenous person has ever had. We're looking at some rough times. You drive around the cities right now, what you're seeing with a lot of the camps of houseless folks that are very prominent is that's just what that's indicative of is that the economic system of capitalism isn't serving the worker. And masses of people are being thrust out of the workforce because they're no longer needed. It's more profitable to take your operations overseas where it's not regulated, where you can pay human beings far less, or if you can't afford it, to automate and fire humans, get rid of humans so you don't have to pay for their wages and their health benefits. And you don't have to deal with a labor union or anything. Get a machine to do that job. So that's what's happening, you know. And on top of that, we had this pandemic come that has greatly exacerbated the economic tensions that were already there. So this is part of a process that's moving in a direction that's not actually going to change, because there's no forces that can change it. It's only going to continue the system of profit is going to continue to seek to maximize profit and to minimize costs. And the cost of human labor is basically expendable because automation makes it so. And within this environment, how does the dynamic of racial identity, ethnic identity, and class, how do those dynamics shift in a way that influences the way we see ourselves and each other? And what do we have to look forward to in terms of how we organize ourselves in our communities and each other, in terms of quality of life and peace, and access to the necessities and the essentials, you know, and a future where we can have a decent life expectancy, you know? And those are the questions. And we don't have any answers because the sands under our feet are shifting at such an alarming rate. This is unprecedented in our lifetimes. I feel like what we're going through now in a lot of ways is as significant as the end of an ice age, in terms of the way that the climate change is shifting our environments and impacting all our systems that we rely on to operate as a human society and civilization. And in the mass extinctions that are the result of the climate crises, they said by 2050, in terms of weight, there's going to be more plastic in the ocean. The volume of plastic in the ocean is going to outweigh fish in the ocean, you know, and the glaciers and the permafrost and melting. So we got a lot to think about as a human race, and I'm very concerned for the future and our children and those who come after, because the wealth that's been consolidated by all these, you know, processes I keep talking about that have made the United States a global superpower is only maintained through war, you know, and we can't bomb our way out of this, you know, and they make so much money off of war and all the contracts that, from, you know, reconstruction to weapons to surveillance, you know, there's no way that those people are going to have a change of heart and walk away from that activity, because it's kept them in power and it's kept them very wealthy. So masses of people who are not needed for a workforce as a workforce to prop up the economy. I'm starting to see what the way this thing is going, increased military repression, you know, for social control.
Right.
Locally. That's all that's coming, man.
Yeah, like that makes me think of remember years ago I got into a little thing with ex-girlfriend's friend because she was getting ready to go, you know, was getting ready to enlist. And, you know, my first thought was like, why are you joining the system? Why, you know, you got all this going for you. Why are you going into the military? Mm-hmm. But, you know, she hit me back with just the like, look, are you paying my bills? Are you doing this? And it's like, it was a real argument. And I was like,
yeah.
But that kind of gets exactly to what you're speaking to, which is there's so much money behind this, and one, the people in power obviously are, you know, making money hand over fist. They're not giving that up. But then you've got so many people, because, you know, we're moving faster towards automation, and, you know, we're not passing any policies to take care of people, even though we have the money to. But we're making people desperate. We're saying, but here's your option. You know, we can feed you if you join into the system of destruction, if you join into, you know, this murderous system. But again, would you rather have a roof over your head? Would you rather have food on your plate or not? And when you're fighting against that, you know, that is it just continues perpetuating these issues. And if that's all you see, again, like, even if you are trying to fight these systems, how do you think about fighting back? Like, if you're trying to fight back against drones, all the words in the world, it's going to be a little hard in your immediate vicinity to be like, no, I need to fight back. So of course, like, a militaristic approach is going to appeal because your safety is at risk. And it's just self-perpetuating.
And the thing about it is, I think one of the coldest parts about it is, like, you start to understand that there's only so many ways, so many directions you can take in terms of how society is organized, you know, and you can go the legal route or the illegal route. You can go the passive route or the militant route. But either way you choose, you're reliant on the same systems of control just to survive. If you drop off completely, you're going to be sleeping in the outdoors. But sleeping outdoors means you're subject to the sweeps that come and move you along and displace you. Mental health becomes more of an issue because your basic necessities aren't met and you're actually suffering in the elements, and you don't have the means to wash and protect yourself, you know, from other people who might be predatory. So that's, again, the incentive to go ahead and do what you can do with the opportunities available is what drives us into the military. Because we're like, look, man, if I don't do something, I'm not going to be able to provide for myself. And at least if I do this, there's going to be some stability. And we're all participating in one version of that. You know, even if it's just keeping a job or paying our bills on time, our money, our energy is going into reinforcing what already exists. And I don't have the answers, man, but I think I just want to be able to continue to ask the right questions and ask those questions in community with my people, and understand that the questions that we ask today have been asked and been being asked. And we have to continue to ask those questions, because the answers that are available are not the ones that sustain life. They're the ones that are actually going to end life for humans. So yeah, those are the questions. You know, the work is all about trying to figure out how to creatively engage these questions in community with people, how to use art so that we can enjoy and create things of beauty as we grapple with these questions, so that we can bring people together in community and dance and reason and talk and eat and laugh and meet each other's children and be invested in each other's well-being and future. That's the best asset that we have, you know, in the face of what we're facing.
Yeah. And I said, I'm kind of in a similar place about saying, like, I know I don't have the answers to these questions, but if we at least start asking the right questions, start putting some, at least provide context for people. I realize I take for granted, one, just working in media, working in news, that, you know, I get paid to consume this information all day. I get paid to, you know, have some understanding of these things. But if you work a different type of job, if you do something else, like, why would I expect you to understand this. So I gotta, it becomes part of my job to help put stuff out, to help contextualize, help put this information out, how support things that actually bring people together and build relationships so they can actually have those conversations, actually exchange that information, and maybe, again, get to a place where we're actually building something that's sustainable, which is so key. And you also just talked about, just the cultural aspect, just the music aspect. I think that's one thing that's been kind of cool to see, at least in this, 2020 now movement, is just in Portland, especially, like how much hip hop has been at the center of so much of like the protest movement here, so much of the like anti-racism movement, and obviously like all the demonstrations that have like made the news and whatnot. But and it's something I've been kind of like akin to, or kind of keen to before, that, again, before 2020, it's just like how many people from Portland's hip hop community are in these education circles, are in these, community organizing circles, and were big presences long before, people were paying attention. So, I guess in a way to try and spin this somewhere hopeful, or a little bit more hopeful, of saying that, if there's something, I guess, hopefully I can see on the horizon, is that not just that we're kind of doing some of this work to try and bring each other together, but that hip hop is at the center of it. So, that's hopeful, right?
Well, it is, and in a very subjective way for me, because I want to give a shout out to friend Andre Middleton and Friends of Noise.
Yeah.
I want to give another shout out to Outside the Frame. I want to give a shout out to Trista, young Black woman on the mic, killing it. We just, in collaboration with Outside the Frame, Portland Public Schools, and Friends of Noise, we're producing a citywide compilation that's called Rose City Rising. It's youth from all over the city and Black Lives Matter activists and musicians. We even got the Oregon Symphony on one of these songs with Jay Prodigy, this 11-year-old Black girl, who's talking about Black Lives Matter and how it's impacted her consciousness and shaped her awareness. So, again, engaging young people who are already driven creatively to be involved with music and poetry and beat making and dancing and rapping, and giving them opportunities to actually start their careers while they're still in high school. And Jay Prodigy is 11, she ain't even in high school, and she got a music video on the big screen at the Hollywood Theater that's produced by professionals, with just as good as anything you might see on MTV or BET. So that is where I'm like, no matter how dark things might appear to be and actually are, there's still opportunities to do work that improves the lives of the people in the community with. And that's what art always has been able to do for me. Being an activist that's solely oriented to social justice organizing, there's a lot of time in meetings and a lot of time on email and a lot of times in demonstrations, but that doesn't necessarily feed my soul. It doesn't bring joy to my life. You know what I mean? And so, like, again, art and the creative process of making beautiful things, it has been able to give me a reason to want to still be here. And because it's done that for me, then I want to help foster that same relationship in young people. Because if it's going to keep them focused on trying to be the best them they can be through this process of creating things, that's just a positive impact, on individual lives, and then on the community that these young people thrive in.
Absolutely. And yeah, on that note, Mike Crenshaw, thank you again for taking the time to come on the show today. And for people want to find out more about you or find out more about the many different projects you're working on, where can they find you?
So I'm at MikeCrenshaw.com. I do need to update the website, but it is up, so you can purchase music and see the bio. So MikeCrenshaw.com. I'm on the socials at Mike Crenshaw for Instagram and Twitter, Facebook, and then check out the It Did Happen Here podcast. It Did Happen Here podcast.com. We just produced that about the history of anti-fascist organizing in Portland, as well as some historical linkages to Minneapolis, where I moved out here from. Stay tuned for Rose City Rising. There's a lot of media. We got the Baldies documentary coming out on Minnesota Public Broadcasting October 18th, 6 p.m. Central. And I know I'm forgetting something. Rebel Wise, my Rebel Wise project is going to be playing at the Alberta Street Pub December 17th. And yeah, we're in the community, man. I'm not that hard to find. And thank you, Bruce. I appreciate you inviting me on the show.
Yeah. Thank you again, man. And just keep up all the great work, and try and get some rest sometime, man.
I'm about to go take a nap right now.
Awesome. Take care, man.